afternoon. This is a presentation for the 9th and 10th graders for the Introduction to International Relations course. Today we are going to talk about state systems. Now, we talked about last week that there are 4 types of state systems. The first system being the independent state system, which consists of political entities that each claim to be sovereign. No superior power is accepted, but states recognize the claims of independence by other states. So in this type of system, each state within and of itself is acting as a sovereign nation. And they do not interfere in the interactions of other states, what they do within their own states. And they believe in the independence of other states. The second type of state system is hegemonic state system, which is where one or more very powerful states dominate the state system. They can constrain the actions of other states and set rules for the world, so they have a direct effect on the external affairs of states. Now, the United States of America in this day and age is considered to be the hegemon of the world, where they have influence on the policies internationally as well as internally within each state. Now, within the hegemonic state system, there are 4 types. Now, you have a unipolarity, which is a single dominant state, which we would characterize as the United States of America in this day and age. We have the second, which is bipolarity, which is 2 states are dominant. Now, the bipolarity was present during the Cold War, when you had the U.S. and the Soviet Union as being the 2 dominant state powers. Dual hegemony was characteristic back in the Roman and Greek Empire, where we had Athens and Sparta in the 5th century BCE. Now, a multipolarity or collective hegemon is when you have 3 or more states that dominate international affairs. Currently, we don't have a historical example of this, but it's labeled as a part of the hegemonic state system. Now, the third state system is the imperial system, which takes in separate societal units, often units in ancient time. Very good examples would be Macedonia, Assyria, Persia, Rome, and the Ottomans. But here, one asserts domination over the others with whom it interacts, and it may be involved in international affairs, unlike in hegemonic systems. This can very much result in unsettled conditions if one or more of the weaker units gain strength, or if a new hegemon in the region rises and decides to take on the current hegemon. The fourth system would be the feudal system, which ran from about the 9th century through the 14th century. Many diverse units comprised it, and power at this point was centralized, claimed by a diverse group of governmental units, only some of which evolved into what we would see today as modern states. And in terms of global jurisdiction, the only current example and historical example we have would be the Roman Catholic Church, known as pre-Reformation as the Christian Church in Rome. Now, we're going to look at some very specific concepts that underlie international relations. Now, the vocabulary words that I'm going to give you, we will see it throughout our study in international relations, and it's important that we focus upon the definitions and memorize them, because we will utilize them consistently. And this is going to be fundamental in our exam. So you guys need to pay very good attention to the definitions that I will be providing to you today. Now, we have sovereignty. What does sovereignty mean? It means the supreme authority in a state. In any state, sovereignty is vested in the institution being the government, being the chambers of government, being a person or a body having the ultimate authority, like I was saying, within the chambers of government. And these chambers are there to impose law on everyone else in the state, and they also have the power to alter any pre-existing law. Now, in international law, it is an essential aspect of sovereignty that all states should have supreme control over their international affairs, subject to the recognized limitations imposed by international law. So in international law, they give recognition to the sovereignty of a state, in that the state is responsible for controlling what goes on within the state. No state or international organization may intervene in matters that fall within the domestic jurisdiction of another state. Domestic jurisdiction being within the state itself, internal affairs. Sovereign, holding the ultimate supreme power and authority within its territory or territories. This is what we were talking about, especially with Thomas Hobbes, in that there's a supreme power and he is the sovereign of the state. And he also executes the use of force and violence sometimes when necessary, internally and externally. An independent state has sovereign power. Now we'll move to the third definition, being that of a nation. A nation differs from the definition of a state. How so? A nation is a society in which people identify with one another on the basis of ethnic, linguistic, religious, cultural, or other commonalities. So it is something characteristic to a cultural identity, in that this group of people share an ethnicity, like the Kurds, for instance. They share a language, they share a religion, a common culture, and other basic commonalities. Now, contrary to the conventional usage in the international relations subfield of political science, the terms nation and state are not synonymous. Why? Because a nation has to do with the ethnicity of an individual, whereas a state, you can have a state in a controlled territory that has several nations within it. A good example would be within Turkey, you have Kurds, you have Syrians, you have Turks. It depends on the ethnicity that when you define a nation, as opposed to a state which can have several nations within one state. There are many stateless nations throughout the world, and there are several states that actually contain several nations, like I was saying, including the former Soviet Union, now Russia, the Republic of China, the former Yugoslavia and its successor states. And we talked about how in Yugoslavia there is an ethnic cleansing, which has relation to annihilating a nation and a cultural ethnic group. Nation state is a sovereign state whose borders roughly correspond to the demographic patterns of the nation. Now, the definition of power, when we use the word power in international relations, what we are referring to is power in interstate relations, which may be defined as a state's ability to control or at least influence other states or the outcome of events. So an exertion of power that influences not only within a state, but outside of the state as well. Now, there are two dimensions that are important here, which are the internal and external dimensions. Now, the internal dimension corresponds to the dictionary definition of power as a capacity for action, in that they have power and the capacity to act. A state is powerful to the extent that it is insulated from outside influence or coercion in the formulation and implementation of policy. So a state is considered powerful when outside actors are unable to influence the actions within the internal state. Now, a common synonym for the internal dimension of power is autonomy. The external dimension corresponds to the dictionary definition of power as a capacity to control the behavior of others and to enforce compliance, which can be within the state as well as outside of the state. Now, in international relations, we will often discuss the collective goods problem. And the central question with the collective goods problem is, how can something be provided to benefit every member of a group, regardless of what each member may contribute to the goods? What does this mean? It is probably easier to provide collective goods or benefits to smaller groups than to larger ones. Now, the problem in the collective goods problem is what? Is that you may have cheaters and free riders that can be identified more easily in a smaller group than in a larger group. So you have within the collective group's problem, the goods problem, in that you will have people who are not contributing. In order for it to be balanced, you have to have people that are contributing from both sides of the story. Now, the definition of cooperation. There are three basic principles that address potential solutions to uncooperative relationships among countries. And that includes, first of all, dominance, second, reciprocity, and identity. Now, in dominance, there is a hierarchy with those at the top of the hierarchy controlling those below them. This is related to an understanding of great powers among states, but it can lead to resentment of those not at the pinnacle. So if those at the peak of this arrangement do not act in everyone's best interest, oppression of those lower on the ladder might follow. Now, this is a common problem even within like a common state system, and that you have a dominant hierarchy where there are people who have overwhelming influence over the different tiers of a society. And this can also happen internationally between states. Now, we'll talk about reciprocity. Now, reciprocity addresses the collective goods challenge by rewarding actions that contribute to the group good. So if I do something favorable to a state, I want the same reaction, reciprocity, for them to also provide me with a good, or to provide me with a service, or to provide me with protection. And this also alludes to punishing those behaviors that are simply self-interested, in that in reciprocity, you cannot just take, you have to give. No central authority is needed in reciprocity, but it can demand very complicated accounting methods and monitoring to track positive contributions and negative actions. Reciprocity is relevant to international relations because it forms the backbone of most norms at many international organizations, because we have international organizations that provide resources and help and services to states, to non-state actors, and what have you. Now, reciprocity can also have a negative side effect too, in terms of, for instance, the example of the arms race or the security dilemma. Now, each state responds to an increase in military material and weapons by others, so this is also can be seen as reciprocity, in that during the Cold War, there was an arms race between the United States and between the Soviet Union in terms of nuclear weapons. So you can see that it can have good effects in terms of humanitarian aid, but it can also have negative effects if you look at the aspect of an arms race or a security dilemma as well. Now, identity. This is a very fundamental aspect in international relations, in recognizing the identity of an individual. And it is very, very complex in today's world, given that even in this day and age, we have shared identities, which may ignore state borders and therefore be transnational. You have people there ethnically Arabic or Kurdish or Turkish, but they live and hold the citizenship of another state. Example, Germany, the United States, Britain. So this creates a complex identity, in that the individual doesn't just associate with the state that they are a citizen of, but they also have a ethnic, national identity. So this creates a complexity in terms of defining an individual. And this principle means that states also have to redefine their interests and make sacrifice to the groups possible. So within a state, and if you have a big ethnic group, for instance, I'm coming back to the example of the Kurds. They have a specific ethnic identity, and they can impact the politics of a state. So there are political actors that appeal to these individuals based on their ethnic identity. Now, identity groups will accept collective good solutions that may not give them the best outcome as individuals because what benefits there remain in the family. What does this mean? Identity means that if one is a member of an in-group based on identity, there must be a corresponding out-group, and this out-group can easily be demonized. So it's like I'm saying, they have an identity, but the problem is it's dispersed between their identity as a citizen, as a religious identity, as a cultural identity. So in the global world that we live in, this is becoming a bigger and bigger problem. Alliances. Now, an alliance can be defined as the agreement between two or more states to work together on mutual security issues. So alliances have to do with states working together on mutual security issues. States enter such cooperative security arrangements to protect themselves against a common or perceived threat. So when different states see a threat, they will form alliances in order to work together against a common threat. Now, by pooling their resources and acting in concert, the alliance partners believe that they can improve their overall power position within the international system and their security relative to states outside of the alliance. So this fortifies their stance. Alliances can either be formal or informal arrangements. What does this mean? A formal alliance is often recognized through the signing of a treaty in which the signatories promise to consider an attack on any one of them as equivalent to an attack on all of them. Now that is the premises of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and that we have an alliance of several states, and they perceive any sort of aggression on a member state within NATO to be an aggression that impacted them state-wise, because that is the nature of the alliance. And you also have the Warsaw Pact. Now, an informal alliance would be much looser and less stable, and you can't really rely on it to a large extent. Why? Because it's just the word of parties involved. There's no charter, there's no group, there's no treaty, and it's just based on involved and ongoing cooperation informally. Now, the Warsaw Pact is important in international relations. Why? Because that was an alliance against NATO. Now, this was during the Cold War, and it was a collective defense treaty among the Soviet Union and 7 Soviet satellite states, which included Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, and Romania in Central and Eastern Europe during the Cold War. So this was a response to the establishment of NATO. And also here, similar to NATO, each state was to come to the defense of others should a foreign entity attack. Now this is the idea of the dual hegemon that we talked about in NATO, because the US and the Soviet Union were two very powerful states during this time, and they were going head to head for control to be the unipolar hegemon. Now, there's the term coalitions, and the coalitions sometimes are thought of as being alliances, especially when states come together against a common threat. Now, a coalition means a joining together. Coalitions are always multilateral, with associates from different states. Multilateral coalitions are generally favored in modern times, aligning several states together to take on a threat to or a concern of all involved, either on the state or the international level. Now, consider the UN and peacekeeping missions containing troops from several or many states. Now, we see that the UN will send peacekeeping troops to a country in turmoil. We often see peacekeepers in Africa. The most we've seen is in Africa. There was also the case of Iraq, where there were peacekeeping missions, and in Afghanistan. Now, in international relations, you will always hear about the clash of civilizations, which is a fundamental argument that theorists either argue against or for in international relations in this day and age. Now, it was first formally suggested by the late Samuel Huntington in 1993, when he hypothesized that future conflicts would occur in the world along what he termed civilizational fault lines. Now, he believes that the religious, ethnic, and cultural identities are creating fault lines which are causing conflict. These lines were, like I was saying, were comprised largely of long-standing cultural and religious histories and identities that he believes would create war. Now, scholars and those interested in politics still debate the utility and validity of Huntington's class of civilizations hypotheses. And a lot of people either, like I said, theorists argue for the idea of the clash of civilizations or against. Now, with the events of September 11, 2001, it really bolstered his position, Huntington. He became very renowned after that, after the events of 9/11. Terrorism. Now, this is another term that we're all familiar with, but we need to be able to systematically define it. Now, terrorism, by definition, is the systematic use of violence to create a general climate of fear in a population to promote a particular political objective. Now, promoting fear, putting in a sense of fear into the population. Now, terrorism has been practiced by political organizations with both rightist and leftist objectives, so you cannot characterize it as being either conservative or liberal. There are, from both spectrums, we see acts of terrorism, as well as by nationalistic and religious groups, by revolutionaries, by freedom fighters, by guerrillas, by paramilitaries, and even by state institutions, such as armies, intelligence services, special troops, and police. So even police can perform terrorist acts. It's not restricted to non-state actors. But the bulk of terrorists are non-governmental actors. So keep this in mind. It can be a state actor, but it doesn't have to be necessarily. Now, we're going to define socialism, which is an important ideology that we need to understand in international relations. Now, socialism is an economic system characterized by what? By usually centralized public ownership of major industries, properties, and natural resources. Now, Europe, a lot of its countries are considered to be socialist. Properties are shared and natural resources are either meted out equitably to workers or used in production. Now, socialism is different from communism, but it's branched out from the idea of communism. Now, in socialist thought, true freedom and true equality require what? Social control of the resources that provide the basis for prosperity in any society. So they believe that the state needs to control the resources so that everybody can benefit from it. Socialism, by definition, is considered the opposite of capitalism. The United States would be an example of a capitalist society. Now, socialism is flexible on 2 points that we need to recognize. The first being that the first concerns the property that society should own or control. Now, some socialists have thought that almost everything except personal items such as clothing should be public property. Now, that is an extreme. It's closer to the idea of communism. And other socialists, however, have been willing to accept or even welcome private ownership of farms, shops, and other small or medium-sized businesses. Now, that would be an example of the socialist system that exists in China, which provides the example of acceding to private endeavors in small businesses. Now, the second area that's flexible in socialism is in which socialists may disagree in how society should manage and control property as well as resources. There are 2 aspects to this. There's the centralists who control resting with the state, where the political party may also actually have some degree of control as in the Soviet Union, and decentralists who believe control should rest at the lowest level possible. That level is closest to the people who would be most affected by control and management decisions. These opposing socialist viewpoints have yet to be fully resolved. So, centralists believe that the state has control, whereas a decentralist would want on the lowest level, like the common individual. Now, the political spectrum, we talked about this, so this would be review for you guys. We have the political left to the political right, which is illustrated in this chart here, okay? We'll come back to the chart in a second, just to explain to you what the spectrum is. Now, it's conceived of as left to right orientation after the French Revolution, during which governing bodies sat with aristocrats and the church on the right, and the common people were on the left, in a governing chamber when viewed from the front of the room at the speaker's position. Now, the simplest left-wing axis, the left, is communism and socialism, like we were talking about. And they are usually regarded internationally as being on the left, whereas on the right, we have nationalism and fascism, okay? Liberalism means different things in different contexts, sometimes left, sometimes right. So you'll see on the chart that liberalism can be here on the left, and it can also move towards the right. Conservatism and reactionary forces are almost always considered on the right. Now, conservatism and right. So this comes back to the idea of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke that we talked about. Now, Thomas Hobbes would be considered on the right. Complete control by a leader. Security is of utmost importance. The freedoms and rights of the individual come after the security and authority of the state. Whereas on the left, where there would be more consideration to the rights and freedoms of the individual here in the leftist, liberal, centralist area. It's just like John Locke, okay? Power projection. Now, this is the capability of a country to project or alternatively physically bring through sea lift or airlift its military power to any part of the world rapidly with little advance notice. So the ability for a country to immediately act and take on a military endeavor. Now, the United States at this time would be assessed to be especially good at this, in that it has the largest inventory of nuclear weapons and the most high-tech weaponry overall. So you will see that they can begin any sort of military attack within 24 hours. Not all countries can do this, and this is also characteristic of what? In that they are a hegemon. Now, that is all I have for you guys today, and we will have a new video come out next week. I want you guys to review within your books. All of this information that I provided to you guys was from page 11 until page 16. Now, these are the most fundamental aspects of international relations, so we need to give it the most and supreme attention. We will move on to finish chapter 1 next week. I know I appreciate your guys' attention, and if you have any questions, you can send them to me on WhatsApp. Thank you.